Hi guys, this little lens right here is currently ranked as one of the top 5 lenses of all time over at DxOMark, and in fact, they rated it as the sharpest lens they have ever tested at this focal length. This is an 85mm full frame lens that can also be used on APS-C cameras. And also, this lens costs a fraction of what it costs to buy from a major brand manufacturer. This may be the most well-kept secret in the camera lens world, so we are going to talk about it. Now, when I found out about those crazy scores from DxOMark, I had to get this lens in for myself and test it out because I love an 85mm focal length. An 85mm focal length, they call it the portrait lens usually. It is a medium telephoto lens and it gives you those wonderful head and shoulder shots if you want to do head shots, things like that. But I find that's also just great for family, and it's the wow factor. An 85mm, especially with a low aperture, like this lens has, this is a 1.8. And when you have a 1.8 on a full frame or even on an APS-C camera, and you take a photo at the 85mm focal length, which is close to 130mm focal length in terms of full frame field of view, if you're using this on an APS-C camera, it just gives you that pop, that wow. When you take a photo with an 85mm 1.8, when you're stopped all the way down, that is when people say, oh, that is a real camera and a real lens, as opposed to just taking a photo with an iPhone and using the fake blur. This thing, I always carry an 85mm, and this thing at this price, oh my goodness, so I had to test it out. And also look at the size difference here. This is my 85mm 1.8 from Sony, and previously I have been saying this is the best value 85mm lens that you can buy. But seeing how this thing, depending on what country you're living in, costs about half of what the Sony does, I mean, the value, maybe it's off the charts with this if we do our tests, and I did do our tests, and I will show you our tests. But I also love an 85mm for street photography because I don't have to get too close to the subjects. I can back away because I'm a shy person. I know, I look like I'm super confident here in the comfort of my basement in Handsome Studios, but when I'm out in the world, I like to take my photos and I don't like to be noticed very much. So having an 85mm out in street photography, or if you're in an APS-C camera and you're at like that 130mm or 127.5 to be exact, you can actually get further away from the action, take all of your wonderful photos, and then just get back in your car and have talked to no one, which is the way that I prefer it. Now, this company has been making lenses for a little while now. This is the Yongnuo company. It's possible that you have not heard of them. When I saw all of the tests and all of the glowing reviews of this lens, I contacted Yongnuo, and they were kind enough to send this lens out at no cost to myself, but they have no input on the video. All views are my own. I was just gonna take a look at this thing at its very low price, and having an f1.8 at 85mm, I figured it was going to be a pretty easy recommendation as long as it wasn't a terrible lens. But I found out, in fact, that it's not just not a terrible lens, it is quite an excellent little lens. Now, if you look at the build quality on this, this is actually the second version of this lens. They have the exact same optics in this 85mm f1.8, but it has a little red ring around it, and it is made mostly of plastic. So optically, it's going to perform exactly the same, but they put this in a metal casing with a smoother focus ring, and in fact, it looks almost exactly like my Sony 35mm f1.8. Okay, so here's my Sony 35mm 1.8, and here's the Yongnuo 85 1.8. You see how similar that build is right there? Oh, I got myself in focus. Right there, it is just, and I love the way that that 35mm is built. So what we have here is a metal lens, and it has a little bit of weather sealing on this newer version here on the back. And having that metal with that smooth ring, I just really, really like this build quality. It also comes with a pretty large sunshade, which is great if you're trying to avoid flares and glaring. We will get to the flare glare test in a bit. I was also very surprised to see it has a autofocus to manual focus switch and a programmable focus hold button. I did not expect this at this price point. Something else I was really surprised to see is right here. You see this? This is a little rubber gasket covering up a USB-C port so you can update the lens via USB-C. So suffice it to say, I really like the build quality on this lens. So now let's take a look at the optical performance. And first, I will compare it to my 85mm f1.8. And if you take a look at these two photos side by side, you can in fact see that the Yongnuo is sharper than the Sony 85mm 1.8. The 85 1.8 from Sony is no slouch, but the Yongnuo is definitely noticeably sharper. Now, if we take a look at chromatic aberration, once again, pleasantly surprised. It was quite well controlled. There is a tiny bit if you zoom in to about 200%, but that is easily correctable in post. Now, when it comes to the longitudinal chromatic aberration, that is a bit of a different story. You will get some longitudinal chromatic aberration. The autofocus areas will show some different coloration when you are down at 1.8, but when you stop down to 2.8 and especially f4, that pretty much goes away entirely. Now, that shouldn't be much of an issue on a portrait lens, and if you are finding you are getting some LOCA, then just switch it down to 2.8 or f4 and it should take care of that. The minimum focus distance on this lens is 0.8 meters, which is exactly the same as my Sony 85 1.8. And the flare and the ghosting on this guy is actually quite good. It is an above average performer. It holds contrast very well. You don't see many big ugly flares, and that is without the lens hood at all. If you put the lens hood on, it virtually eliminates any glares and ghosting, but even without the lens hood, it is quite well controlled. The autofocus was fairly snappy and reliable, not quite as fast as my Sony 85 1.8, but not far behind at all, especially in APS-C, the continuous autofocus. Now, some of the reviews of the older version of this lens, the one that was in the plastic casing, they said that the autofocus, it took a while sometimes, or sometimes the autofocus wasn't quite as reliable, but that was a while ago, and this thing now has had several updates. This is version 6, I believe, of this lens, and I had no trouble at all gaining autofocus reliably, consistently with this lens. No trouble at all with the autofocus. Now, there is some focus breathing on this lens, as there are with many 85mm lenses, so I don't know if that's going to be a problem for you. Most people don't shoot video at 85mm, or at least do long focus pulls at 85mm, and nor do a lot of people use this for things like landscape, where you have to stack a lot of photos and try to blend them in post. But if focus breathing is a big issue for you at the 85mm focal length, this is where this will struggle a little bit. It will have some focus breathing. Now let's talk about the bokeh on this lens. Let's take a look at some bokeh balls here in my backyard. I have the lights there, and the bokeh balls are excellent. They are quite round, and they are not messy at all. I don't see really any hint of onion ringing. I was really impressed. You don't see that halo, that green halo around the bulbs. The bokeh was just stupendous. And when it comes to the out of focus backgrounds, they just look really, really good. They're creamy. It blurs very nicely. The fall off is wonderful. I was really, really impressed with the bokeh from this lens. So I have to agree with DxOMark. This is a steal of a lens, a true hidden gem right here. 85mm f1.8 in a tiny little body, nice lightweight, but ruggedly built with that metal casing. It is as sharp as a lens as you are going to find. It has good chromatic aberration, has wonderful image quality. It has great bokeh, good flare control, good ghosting control, reliable, quick autofocus. What is not to like about this lens right here? So the only 85mm that is rated better than this lens by DxOMark is actually the Sigma 85mm f1.4, but that is a much bigger and heavier lens and far more expensive than this guy right here. Check the links for yourself. Depending on what country you live in, it will be slightly different prices, but it will blow you away, I am sure, wherever you live, the price of this guy right here. It is about, here in Canada, it's about half the cost of this pretty good value lens, this 85mm 1.8 from Sony. So let me know down below if this is something you'd be interested in. If not, tell me what type of lenses and focal lengths you are interested in. We'll have a little conversation about it. Thanks for watching this. We'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.